Okay, the Wright Brothers, lesson 8. So we're reading chapter 6, Horsepower and Propellers, pages 65 through 74. So today we're going to learn about all the work the brothers had done to invent the powered airplane. So as I'm reading, think about what you'd write in our journal about our failed test flight today. Horsepowers and propellers. The Wright brothers could not just take a motor and put it into their gliders. First, they needed a motor that was light yet powerful. Then they had to design propellers that would produce enough thrust to drive a flying machine through the air. Finally, they had to build an aircraft body sturdy enough to carry the weight and withstand vibrations of the motor and propellers. So that's a lot to accomplish. I wonder if they will figure everything out themselves or if they'll have help. We'll have to keep reading to find out. Wilbur wrote to several manufacturers of gasoline engineers, asking if they could supply an engine that would produce at least 8 horsepower, yet weigh less than 200 pounds. No company was willing to take on the assignment. Wilbur and Orville decided to build the motor themselves with the help of Charlie Taylor, a mechanic that they had hired to help out in the bicycle shop. So now we know that they did have help. So horsepower is not generated by horses. It is just the amount of power needed to run an engine. The higher the number, the more power an engine has. We didn't make any drawings, Taylor later recalled. One of us would sketch out the part we were talking about on a piece of scratch paper, and I'd spike this sketch over my bench. In just 6 weeks, they had the motor on the block testing its power. A marvel of lightness and efficiency. It weighed 179 pounds and generated more than 12 horsepower. Remember, they needed a motor that weighed less than 200 pounds and had a minimum of 8 horsepower, so they surpassed their goal. The propellers were much more difficult, since no reliable data on aerial propellers existed. What at first seemed a simple problem became more complex the longer we studied it, wrote Orville. With the machine moving forward, the air flying backward, the propellers turning sideways, and nothing standing still, it seemed impossible to find a starting point from which to trace the various simultaneous reactions. Our minds became so obsessed with it that we could do little other work. So why would they become obsessed with figuring out the propeller? Talk it over with a partner. During several months of study, experiments, and discussion, Wilbur and Orville filled no less than 5 notebooks with formulas, diagrams, tables of data, and computations. They were the first to understand that an aerial propeller works like a rotary wing. The same physical laws that produce upward lift when a curved wing slices through the air will also produce forward thrust when a curved propeller blade rotates. Once they had grasped this idea, the Wrights were able to design propeller blades with the right diameter, pitch, and area for their needs. Isn't it astonishing that all of these secrets have been preserved for so many years just so that we could discover them? Orville told a friend. Well, our propellers are so different from any that have been used before that they will have to either be a good deal better or a good deal worse. They decided to use 2 propellers turning in opposite directions so that any twisting effect on the aircraft would be neutralized. The propellers were connected to the motor through a sprocket and chain transmission, like the kind used to drive a bicycle. The motor rested on the lower wing to the right of the pilot, so it would not fall on him in case of a headlong crash. The balance of the motor's extra weight, the right wing, was 4 inches longer than the left. In the Wright brothers' gliders, the wing warps tires had twisted the entire wing up or down. In the new powered machine, the front edge of each wing was fixed rigidly in place. Only the rear outer edges of the wing tips could now be flexed. Much like the movements of the ailerons or ailerons on a modern cradle to operate with a wing warping and a tail rudder and a wooden hand lever to control the forward elevator. With a wingspan of just over 40 feet, the new machine was the biggest yet. They called it their first flyer. There wasn't enough space in the bicycle shop workroom to assemble the entire machine. The center section alone was so big that it blocked the passage leading to the front of the shop. When a customer walked in, one of the brothers had to go in a side door and walk around to the front to wait on the customer. They didn't see their flyer in one piece until the parts were shipped to the Outer Banks and assembled there. So, I have this diagram here to show you. Wing warping in the 1903 Wright Flyer served the same function as ailerons on a modern aircraft. So Wilbur and Orville returned to their camp at Kill Devil Hills on September 25, 1903, and again found the storm-ravaged camp building. They made repairs and put up a second building to use as a workshop for assembling and housing their flyer. On days with good winds, they took out their old 1902 glider for practice flights. On calm or rainy days, they worked on the new machine indoors. Their progress was slowed by frustrating problems with the propeller shafts and the transmission sprocket wheels, which kept coming loose as the motor was being tested. Meanwhile, winter arrived early. Rain, snow, and freezing winds buffeted their camp. The water in their wash basin was frozen solid in the morning. They converted an old carbide can into a wood-burning stove and piled on blankets when they went to bed. We have no trouble keeping warm at nights, Wilbur wrote home. In addition to the classifications of last year, to wit, 1, 2, 3, and 4 blanket nights, we now have 5 blanket nights, and 5 blankets and 2 quilts. Next come 5 blankets, 2 quilts, and fire. Then 5, 2, fire, and hot water jug. This is as far as we've got so far. Next come the addition of sleeping without undressing, then shoes and hats, and finally overcoats. We intend to be comfortable while we are here. So let's summarize what we read on pages 66 and 67. The Wright brothers continued to work on their propellers and decided to use 2 propellers that would turn in opposite directions to keep the plane from twisting. They built their largest airplane yet, and they called it their first flyer. But they continued to face problems with the propeller, and Orville had to return to Ohio to build another part. That's what I'm going to read. Pictures here. It says the Wright's first powered airplane sits outside the camp building at Kill Devil Hills in November 1903. Wilbur stands in the doorway. It's kind of hard to see, but he is right here. It says, on windy days, the Wright brothers took out their old 1902 glider for practice flights. The 1903 camp buildings are visible down below. So you can see. Orville assembling the 1903 machine in the Flyer's hangar. The propeller shafts gave them so much trouble that Orville had to go all the way back to Dayton to have new ones made. He was returning to North Carolina on the train when he read a newspaper story about Samuel Pierpont Langley's second and last attempt to launch a man-carrying airplane on December 8, 1903. Once again, the great aerodrome and its pilot had crashed into the Potomac. and so had the 73,000 Langley had spent on it. So far, the Wrights had spent less than $1,000 on their still untested flyer. Orville reached Kill Devil Hills with the new propeller shafts on December 11th. The brothers were anxious to test their flyer before the weather got any worse. To launch the machine, they had built a movable starting track, a 60-foot-long wooden rail made of four 15-foot sections. The top of the rail was covered with a thin metal strip. For takeoff, the flyer would be placed over this track with its landing skids resting on a small two-wheeled dolly, or truck as the Wrights called it, which ran freely along the rail. When the propeller started to turn, the flyer would ride along the monorail on its truck, heading into the wind until it gained enough airspeed to lift off and fly. The Wrights called this starting track the Grand Junction Railroad. So, the author said the plane was heading into the wind until they gained enough airspeed to lift or fly. Is that a writer's mistake? Raise your hand if you think they really flew in the same direction that the wind was blowing. So actually, a plane always takes off into the wind because it needs air to go under the wings to lift them up. They were ready for their first trial on Monday, December 14th, but the wind that day wasn't strong enough to permit a launching from level grounds. Instead of waiting any longer, they decided to try a downhill launching from the side of Big Kill Devil Hill. They hoisted a red signal flag to the top of a pole, alerting the life-saving station a mile away. Before long, 5 men, 2 small boys, and a dog came trudging up the beach. The lifesavers had agreed to act as witnesses and help move over 700 pounds of flying machine over the sand. So, why do they need witnesses? What do you think? Everyone pitched in, balancing the flyer by hand. They rolled it along the starting rail, moving each 15-foot section of track from the rear to the front as they went along. When they reached the bottom of the big hill, the entire 60-foot track was laid on the hillside. Then the flyer was pulled up the rail and placed in position. With the slope of the track and thrust of the propellers and the machines starting directly into the wind, we did not anticipate any trouble in getting up flying speed up to 60-foot monorail. Getting up flying speed on the 60-foot monorail track, Orville recalled. So he's saying that he doesn't anticipate any trouble. So I wonder if he did. What do you predict? Talk it over with a partner. Pictures here. So the flyer sits at the top. It's movable 60-foot starting track. The crew of the U.S. Life-Saving Station at Kill Devil Hills, located about a mile from the Wrights' camp. These men became the world's first aircraft ground crew. Now remember when the author describes a scene, it is helpful to visualize description, try to make a mental picture, right? So listen carefully and visualize as I read about the flyer's first flight. They started the motor. The propellers turned over, paddling loudly. The transmission chains clattered. The motor popped and coughed, and the whole machine seemed to shudder and shake. The 2 small boys took one look, backed away, and went racing across the sand dunes with the dog at their heels. Wilbur and Orville tossed a coin to decide who should try first. Wilbur won. He lay down on the lower wing, sliding his hips into the paddle wing warping cradle. Orville took a position at one of the wings to help balance the machine as it roared down the starting track. Then Wilbur loosened the restraining rope that held the flyer in place. The machine shot down the track with such speed that Orville was left behind, gasping for breath. After a 35 to 40-foot run, the flyer lifted up from the rail. Once in the air, Wilbur tried to point the machine up at too steep an angle. It climbed a few feet, stalled, settled backward, and smashed into the sand in its left wing. Orville's stopwatch showed that the flyer had flown for just 3.5 seconds. Do you think a flight of 3.5 seconds is enough to count as a first flight? Wilbur wasn't hurt, but it took 2 days to repair the damage of the flyer. They were ready to try again on Thursday, December 17th, 1903. So the crash doesn't stop him. So what do you think they learned from the crash? By your partner. They woke that morning to freezing temperatures and a blustery 27-mile-an-hour wind. Puddles of rainwater in the sand hollows around their doors, hoping the wind would die down a little. At 10 o'clock, with the wind as brisk as ever, they decided to attempt a flight. The conditions were very unfavorable, wrote Wilbur. Nevertheless, we had set our minds on being home by Christmas, as determined to go ahead. They hoisted their signal flag to summon the lifesavers. Then, in the biting wind, they laid down all 4 sections of the starting track in a level stretch of sand just below their camp. They had to go inside frequently to warm their hands in the carbide can stove. By the time the starting track was in place, 5 witnesses had shown up. 4 men from the life-saving station and a teenage boy from the nearby village of Nag's Head. They helped haul the flyer over to the launching site. Okay, so we're going to stop reading here. So at that last paragraph there. And we'll pick up tomorrow.